First Nations Fisheries Council can develop the capacity to put together a strategic plan and an action plan. So out of today and out of the 7 other workshops, the information that comes out of it is going towards developing that strategic plan and that action plan on water for fish. The governance, the 6 regional workshops were really about how we build the knowledge frameworks so that people can be water managers and water stewards. We'll try and roll up what everybody has said in some succinct way so we can make some key decisions about what we want to say about the water of management for the management of water for fish, and strategic directions on governance, strategic directions on what we want to say about economic opportunities. All kinds of things have come out of the various different workshops.
I think it was in 2007 that the First Nations Summit Chiefs had put forward a resolution to establish the First Nation Fisheries Council, that we do not speak on behalf of any First Nation, and we recognize the autonomy and entity of each First Nation to develop their own infrastructure, their governance system that is going to meet the needs of the people in their respective communities. Initially, in response to the province's Water Act modernization process in 2010, the 3 organizations got together and passed resolutions committing to hosting a province-wide BC First Nation Right to Water Forum and an action plan to assert First Nations jurisdiction over water. So working together is something that we need to do, because we know as First Nations in British Columbia, we can't do it alone. And that's why I emphasize the need for all of us to be able to understand who's going to be responsible as a minister, and so that we can get to their deputy ministers and then continue the advocacy work and the lobbying on behalf of the First Nations with respect to water.
Do keep in mind, too, that Dan's already started to lay out for the Leadership Council where their strategy is going overall, but he's also talked with you about the principle that the Leadership Council groups have, that they're going to support what you want to do in your communities as well. So think about what those strategies that they develop at the Leadership Council, what they enable your community to do, and then we'll start to talk about what the Fish Council can support in kind of joining between your local community and the province-wide scale. So Dan talked about a little bit in his background. In 2006 to 2007, the First Nations Fisheries Action Plan was created. That's the document on the left there. And that was done from previous work and discussed priorities and aspirations related to fisheries and aquatic resources. So there's a connection there with water. The connection comes with fish for our organization. And based on these discussions, the First Nations Leadership Council drafted the First Nations Fisheries Action Plan in 2007. For those that know the organization, you know too that we developed this, a strategic plan to implement the action plan that was created by 203 First Nations. So if you've been with us at any of our meetings, and you've had Jordan present, you've probably seen this, what he talks about, regional and structural alignment. And it's a difficult concept, I think, first, and that's why we worked on this graphic here. It's on the right-hand side, and this represents what would be different geographic regions of the First Nations Fisheries Council, and how we try to align those together so that we can get work done that we need to get done together at different scales. The initial 6 are the 6 strategic areas from our action plan. So there's relationships and reconciliation, aquatic resource sharing, which folks in fisheries know as allocation conversations, safeguarding habitat and responding to threats, aquatic resource management, building a solid economic opportunities for First Nations, and a negotiation and litigation strategy. And I think, Dina, unless I'm wrong, this last one's kind of sat relatively dormant as we continue to develop our relationships with the regional organizations and with the Leadership Council. This action plan was then brought through into the strategic plan, and that's the document I talked about before. So this is how we started to try to operationalize some of the grander statements that you might see in the action plan itself. So we have what we call 4 pillars or 4 posts of the work that we do in our strategic plan, and that's the protection of rights and sustainable fisheries, capacity development, enhanced First Nations economic performance, and strategic outreach through effective communications and legitimate processes. That legitimate processes piece goes back to that schematic that we showed you before and is supported by the charter document and the declaration and protocol. Just wanted to highlight some of the areas that we think our mandate overlaps with what Dan had talked about, reminding ourselves that there's not going to be a First Nations water organization or a water council, that the existing councils need to work together. So underneath safeguarding habitat and responding to threats, we're going to continue to evaluate impending changes to the Fisheries Act, the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, the Water Sustainability Act, and the Species at Risk Act. And you know that all of those are interconnected by water at some point. And we're going to continue to advocate for habitat protection and restoration, but the current fiscal, legislative, and political and environmental environment creates challenges to us implementing these.
How long are we going to be talking about water? How many more years?
It's a little bit of a frustration because we sit as IMOG, we sit up with the river, the tracks, and all these things. We talk about all of our issues as First Nations people for 2 springs. Oh, we hear your comments, but you know what? Business as usual. So these are the kind of things that really concern me when we're trying to get somewhere as First Nations people on the coast. You know, so what we'd like to do, I mean, because this is a draft, and I don't want to show that camera over there with the draft, I'll be in trouble with our nation, but, you know, but those are the kind of things in the hopes that we can get somewhere soon.
Ryan Tui is a speaker here from the Yukon River Intertribal Watershed Council. It's a group that has been operating for 16 years, and they have, over the past little while, developed a governance accord, is it?
A strategy for right now.
Okay. Ryan's going to talk about the experience of the Yukon River Intertribal Watershed Council and how we can perhaps look at those as our own models.
So these are just some pictures of our watershed. We are, just to give you a little bit of background, we're part of our watershed gets up into the Arctic Circle, and we have groups of Wicket and Witchin and Yupik and several other kind of major tribes and First Nations that form our council. We work with 70 different First Nations and tribes kind of across the border. And so there's one representative from each of those First Nations and tribes, and then that group gets together every 2 years at what we call a summit, where we basically review what's gone on over the last 2 years and then kind of set the future direction. And you can see this is this diagram right here is essentially all the different water quality sampling points that we have throughout the watershed. So we have pretty good coverage of that 4,000 kilometer stretch of river and different places. And it's all done through the community.
What I'm going to do is introduce an activity where we're going to actually speak to the key things that you guys, that has come out of the water workshops, and then try and take it to a level of, okay, who's gonna do what, when, and in particular, what would you like, what do you see under all of those kinds of headings as we introduce the various different groups, as to what activity should happen, kind of where, just because we do want action on this, we do want to go forward. So this is gonna be the Aboriginal rights group. This group is gonna be resourcing and revenues. You guys are gonna be water quality, and your group is planning processes. So what are you going to do? And if you don't think that you can contribute the most to this particular group, there's this group called education. Okay? Education right here in capacity building.
Okay, so that's the strategy. And what's the action?
They're putting out products. But it's more because it doesn't take pictures very well.
We take water, we have no regard for the authority of Canada or the province to tell us where we take water. This time we had our
identification of water quality benchmarks, facilitate technology knowledge.
Traditional ecological knowledge.
Yeah.
So we had at the local level, in terms of receiving royalties, how to get fair resource sharing. And the group felt that a model was needed. We needed, and that the First Nations, perhaps Energy and Mining Council could help with that, and also the Fisheries Council could deal with that as well.
I just want to remind people that dollars come from government taxes, mining associations, et cetera, liquor, blah, blah, and it goes on and on and on. And so we get our funds from government. Interesting about Enbridge, they provided financial resources to First Nations to do a study, and that all comes from the referral process. And the referral process, many of the First Nations are saying, you as industry have to pay for building our capacity to ensure that we do a study in our that particular area, so that we can come up with our own findings.
If anything, First Nations are holding the line on this planet in terms of helping it to, survive longer and us to survive as a result. So you can sometimes play the monetary game, but you got to be really careful about how you, keep the context, define it yourselves, and say, we're going to admit that the minimum value of this is this dollars, but it's also, like you're saying, all these other non-monetary values. So we have to be really careful with it.
We need to secure who owns the water. Legitimate First Nations rights to the water. How are we going to do that? Prove it. Number 2, develop bylaws with other public and private, ensure water for fish and human consumption. Evaluate existing laws and regulations and can't read your writing.
With respect.
With respect to protecting and maintaining adequate water for fish and human consumption.
So we framed it under free, prior, informed consent. When we talk about rights and protecting our rights. The biggest discussion in our group was to quantify our rights and then have the government amend their statutes to protect those rights. Implementation, what we talked about earlier today. So that was quite a healthy discussion, and we come to some resolution and we solved it. So that's how it gets done, is to have it amended by statute.
What we need to do is remake that regime, that management regime, with Aboriginal interests and rights as a priority. Before the permit is issued, before the use is implemented, you should know you're going to be accommodated. Your nation each nation is autonomous. Nobody else can say for you what's good enough. So that legislation has to be amended. So they have to come and talk to your government. But at the same time, you have to be equipped to be able to answer the question in their language. Because that disconnect between our people and the rest of Canada and British Columbia, if it continues, we will have no rights. Right now, the way those rights are working, they're minimizing our rights to being just a regular Canadian. Their own law tells them we're not just a regular Canadian. We have Aboriginal rights in the international community. It's the Indigenous rights. And they say they recognize it, let's make them live up to it. That's what we've got to do with it.
Water, it's the nectar of the gods. It's important to all life on this planet. We've got to communicate, coordinate, create awareness, lobby, educate, have an action plan, evoke the urgency of this. Collaboration with like-minded peoples like Frontier Foundation's Operation Beaver, the oldest Indigenous registered charitable organization in this country. So capacity building through partnerships and deliver effective knowledge transfer that gets results.
So just a little bit about the Fraser Basin. I think most of you know all about it. It's a huge part of the province, about 1/4 of British Columbia. But probably one of the most important things is that besides Aboriginal people living here right from time immemorial, it's also home to many other people, and it contributes 80% of BC's economy, which is a huge economic driver, and that's why we have to make sure that our natural resources are protected. And as you know, probably still, if not the greatest salmon producing river system in the world, one of them. And that's what basically brought the whole Fraser Basin Council together, was the whole need to do something about our salmon stocks. I was glad to see somebody talk about climate change. Climate change is something that's facing us all, that we've got to get on top of. It's going to be really tough to mitigate, but more importantly, we have to adapt to the changing climate. Weather variability is just changing our lives drastically. So how can we adapt to that and be able to manage accordingly? And then, of course, why are we here? We want to build strong, sustainable regions and communities. So those are the 3 top priorities that we continue to work on throughout the system. Okay, so what I wanted to talk about, this is what Sherry asked me to really focus on, is collaborative watershed governance, because that's basically the theme of today's workshop. And so what are some of the key principles that we've picked up over 16 years of our work? Well, it was great to see my group. I didn't put them up to it. They came up with that term, accountability. And that's what it's all about, right? We're all accountable for our actions. We're not able to do that. We've got to have transparency in our decision making. We can't just do things behind closed doors. We've got to work together more effectively and in a much more open and inclusive manner, which is the second one. And the third one, we've got to be effective and efficient in our decision making. We have to be responsive to changing needs and circumstances, and we have to find better ways to collaborate in our decision making. I don't think we really want to see top-down decision making, but at the same time, bottom-up isn't going to have the clout. So we need the 2 of them working together. That's what the Fraser Basin Council model does.
And action is what can be done, and strategic is how we can do it, and what are the things that we need to have in our conversations to do that. So I want you to focus on that, and we'll talk a little bit about what's happening with the Water Act modernization process, which happened a little while ago, and what is then our role potentially in a new legislative environment. What are some specific actions or strategies or concerns and action plans items that might get us ahead of driving the bus if they're actually looking at changes to legislation?
The time is right now. This is the time to make a change, and you know, when I talk to the Okanagan youth about that, they stand up and stomp their feet and throw their chairs back. And
I'll reinforce the fact that we have a sovereign right to our culture, to our water, to our fish, to our resources. And that we need to bring together our First Nations with respect to that cultural right, sovereignty to the land, the resources, the water, and the medicines, and the plants, etc. Because without the water, of course, we're not there.
So these types of meetings are just really invaluable to us at the Fisheries Council and the work that we do. And so, with gratitude, thank you for everyone that was able to travel to be here today and to share with us today.
I like where we're going. And I want to see the 14 regions, hopefully it's not just another one of the governments saying what they usually say is we don't have enough funds to look at all 14 regions. We'll just use the Fraser River and the Skeena River, and that'll be it for the watershed funding. And again, we'll be left out of that situation of being together and trying to provide our own protection for our fishing nets. I heard something at coffee time that really makes a lot of sense. If you come from Nina, as usual. Yeah. It's an Elba, time for a little less conversation, time for more action.
That as a theme song, I love this conversation, a little more action.
I said it might be the theme for this.